I'm Nancy Morawetz. I am also a professor at the law school, and I co-direct the Immigrant Rights Clinic. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about immigrants and issues having to do with protests, both the power of immigrant protests and vulnerabilities that immigrants face. To the extent that people have questions about the impending disaster that we face in immigration, I just wanted to let you know there are flyers on the side. We're going to be doing a teach-in on November 28th at the law school that's geared to sort of the specific legal rights of immigrants and things that we're worried about with the upcoming administration. So the first thing I want to say is that for all the discussion about vulnerability, and there are a lot of things to say about that, and I'll be talking about that later, protests by immigrants have played a huge role in the public space and in driving policy, and have been incredibly important, over the history of the United States. So, in recent years, in 2006, when Representative Sensenbrenner from Wisconsin proposed a law that would have made simply being in this country a crime for people who didn't have papers. There was an outpouring of immigrant protests in the streets all over this country, and that law ultimately did not go into effect. And and those protests made a real difference, and they made a real difference in terms of the public discussion of the issues. More recently, in 2012, and actually leading up to then, protests by undocumented youth are, single-handedly responsible for, first of all, the DREAM Act almost becoming law, although it didn't become law, and then ultimately in forcing the hand of the administration to have the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program that went into effect in 2012. I mean, that simply would not have happened without the courageous efforts of undocumented youth throughout this country, some of which was done through properly permitted protests, and some of which was done through people taking enormous risks. And that made a huge difference. And so I think that then talking about the risks to immigrants, runs the danger of sort of saying, oh, well, it's too dangerous. Well, it is dangerous for people who are not citizens, and I think that is an important message to everybody who is a citizen and a more privileged citizen in terms of how important their solidarity is in issues having to do with immigrant rights, because some people are more vulnerable in protests than other people. But so I want to talk about those vulnerabilities, but at the same time, I want to recognize that people cast those vulnerabilities aside and make decisions to do very brave things, and that has made a huge difference. So in terms of vulnerabilities, the first thing is, there's just a general truism that interactions with the criminal justice system are just not a very helpful thing if you're a non-citizen. And that's true at many, many levels. But the current situation, even in a city like New York City that is more protective of immigrants than other cities, is that once you are fingerprinted, your fingerprints are sent to FBI databases, and there's nothing about any policy of any so-called sanctuary city which is stopping fingerprints from going to the Department of Homeland Security and from people being on their radar simply because of an arrest, no matter what happens with a disposition. And then secondly, as to dispositions, immigration law is pretty complicated about this, and if you are a non-citizen or a non-citizen who's ever arrested, it is essential to get specific targeted advice about the question of how to try to fight against any negative disposition, or if you're going to get a negative disposition from the criminal justice system, shaping what it is, because this is a completely non-intuitive area of law, and you really need advice. Things that you would assume are really nothing much can actually be pretty important. And so obviously for people who are undocumented, the risk might in many ways be the highest, because there doesn't need to be any disposition in order for somebody to be targeted because they're identified as having an arrest. But certain dispositions, for example, disorderly conduct, which is a violation in New York, it's generally considered, one of the most minor, unimportant criminal dispositions. It's pretty common for people who are, arrested in the context of civil disobedience. Though many people get their cases dismissed, and lawyers often are able to get cases dismissed, but some people will wind up with a disorderly conduct disposition. Under current practice, even with respect to, the current administration, those violations are called misdemeanors, and they count against the number of misdemeanors that disqualifies you from DACA, for example. So, so they can matter. And I think we should worry that in the future, the direction of the law will take is that sort of thing will matter even more. For somebody who has lawful permanent resident status, there are many, many dispositions through the criminal process that don't make somebody deportable, and others that do. And you want to sort of be very clear in pleading to anything to understand which are which. And it doesn't have to do with, whether you serve any jail time or other things that might seem to make sense to you. So that's just something to be very careful about. And I would say increasingly, the criminal defender organizations know this and they know how to advise you, but at the same time, you want to be proactive because, a lot of people think they know this area because they know a little piece of this area, but it is a very, very complicated area of law, and you want to make sure you're getting specific advice. And then, for anyone, there is also this question of what organizations are you supporting? And this has not been as big an issue recently for permanent residents but there's this very, very broad law about material support of a terrorist organization. Then the immigration law defines terrorist organization in its own bizarre way that has no connection to what you would think would be the right definition. And those laws could be interpreted and applied in more harsh ways than we currently imagine. The other thing I would say is that, obviously for people who are on various visas or are on a visa and then they're seeking to get another visa later on, or they're traveling and getting new visas when they come back or anything like that, there is a lot of discretion on the part of the immigration agency and the State Department about when they do and don't grant visas. At times that's been abused in the past. Congress has fought back against some of that. But, the power for that abuse and the difficulty of proving that abuse is actually happening is just a reality of our immigration system. So, where there is just a lot of discretion being exercised, and you have to look at who's ultimately going to be exercising that discretion. So, I don't want to be alarmist about it. I think that, there are many people who work in these agencies, and they administer the law, and they will continue to administer the law in the way they have for a long time. But with changes at the top, we of course don't know all of what's going to happen, and so there are risks that non-citizens face with respect to protests that are simply different from the risks that citizens face. Just as among citizens, there are citizens who face greater risks than other citizens because of, racially discriminatory practices that take place on the part of the police. So it's sort of like it's just part of the system. There are a lot of actors who have a lot of discretion, and that discretion is going to be applied differently to different people. And when one can say, well, there's some kind of selective prosecution going on, it's hard to fight those battles. And in the immigration field, it's particularly hard. So that's all just to say that at the end of the day, there are risks. There are special risks that are there as a non-citizen. At the same time, non-citizens speaking out with a loud voice, speaking out with other people in solidarity, have made a huge difference in the past, and we are at a time when we are facing dangers, and it's hard to see that silence is really going to be a better option. So that's kind of the situation we're in, and yeah, so that's all I could describe as where it is and where it might go. So.